I sat alone in the dim glow of the living room, surrounded by the familiar silence that had started to feel stifling. The shadows shifted across the walls, moving slowly, stretching like dark secrets unfolding before me. I pulled my knees close to my chest, cocooning myself on the couch. It was chilly tonight, but I knew the goosebumps prickling my arms were more than a reaction to the temperature. There was something else in the air, something almost tangible. A whisper of doubt, one I hadn't wanted to admit to myself. This nagging feeling had crept into my mind weeks ago, maybe even months, growing louder in moments like these, when I was left alone with my thoughts. Matt, my husband, was once my rock. He had a laugh that could melt the sharpest of my anxieties and a warmth that used to make me feel invincible. But over the past year, something had shifted. At first, I thought it was work stress. His company was pushing a huge project through. He was traveling more, taking later calls, working weekends. I was used to the ups and downs of his job, and I tried to be supportive, brushing off the doubts. But lately, the silences between us felt like chasms. Little things I'd never noticed before began to stand out, like how he always took his phone with him, even if he was just going to the bathroom or taking out the trash, or how he'd glance at the screen with a fleeting, almost guilty expression before flipping it face down. These small changes, things that once would have been easy to brush off, now seemed to scream at me, filling my mind with dark, unwelcome thoughts. What if he was hiding something? The thought gnawed at me, bringing an ache that I didn't know how to soothe. I couldn't bring myself to ask him, not yet, not without something concrete. What if I was wrong? What if I was just being paranoid, letting my insecurities cloud my judgment? But at the same time, I felt like a stranger in my own marriage, like there was an entire part of him he was keeping from me. Ethan, my sweet Ethan. If there was one constant in my life, one source of pure, unfiltered joy, it was my son. At 9 years old, he had a spark in his eyes that seemed to light up every room he entered. He was wise beyond his years, perceptive in a way that sometimes caught me off guard. In the chaos of my swirling doubts, Ethan was my anchor, grounding me when I felt like I might just float away. He had always been a sensitive child, picking up on the smallest shifts in my mood. Lately, he'd been staying a little closer to my side, slipping his hand into mine more often, or climbing onto the couch to sit with me, curling up like he did when he was much younger. I knew he could sense my sadness, my frustration. He didn't know why, but in his own quiet way, he was trying to be there for me. It broke my heart that he felt the need to take on that role. I should have been his rock, not the other way around. One evening, after a long day of school, he shuffled into the kitchen, his backpack slung over one shoulder, his hair a bit tousled from playing outside. I was standing by the counter, stirring a pot of soup, lost in thought, when he walked over and wrapped his arms around my waist. "Hey, buddy," I said, ruffling his hair. "Everything okay?" He looked up at me, his big brown eyes filled with a seriousness that was almost startling. "Mom," he began, his voice soft, "are you sad?" The question hit me like a punch to the chest. I forced a smile, blinking back the tears that had become all too familiar lately. "No, sweetheart," I lied, running a hand through his hair. "Just tired, that's all." But he didn't look convinced. He gave me one last searching glance before nodding, as though accepting my answer for now, even if he didn't quite believe it. He then picked up his backpack and started chattering away about his day, filling the kitchen with his cheerful voice. I tried to listen, I really did, but my mind kept drifting back to Matt, to the shadows in our marriage that seemed to grow darker with every passing day. After dinner, as I tucked him into bed, he wrapped his arms around my neck and held me tight, longer than usual. "I love you, Mom," he whispered. "I love you too, more than anything," I replied, holding him close, trying to absorb some of his warmth, his innocence. In that moment, I made a silent promise to myself. No matter what happened, no matter what I discovered, I would protect him. I would shield him from the hurt I was feeling, even if it meant carrying it alone. He was my world, my anchor, and I couldn't bear the thought of him being pulled into the mess I felt brewing beneath the surface of our lives. A week later, the unease had started to morph into something sharper, something that pushed me toward action. It was a quiet Thursday evening, and Matt was working late again. He had texted me around 5 to say he'd be home after 10, some last-minute project that couldn't wait. I had nodded to myself, accepting his explanation as I had 100 times before, but this time, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. After putting Ethan to bed, I wandered into our bedroom, intending to grab a book and distract myself. But as I crossed the room, my eyes landed on Matt's nightstand. His phone was sitting there, charging, almost innocently. I hesitated, feeling my heart hammer in my chest. I had never been one to snoop. I'd always believed that trust was the foundation of any strong relationship. But now, that foundation felt like it was crumbling beneath me. Before I knew it, I was standing over his phone, staring down at the black screen, my hand hovering, trembling. I felt a mix of guilt and anger, the two emotions battling inside me as I debated what to do. I could leave it, walk away, convince myself that I was just overreacting, or I could open it, look for something, anything, that might explain this distance between us. Finally, I couldn't hold back any longer. My hands shook as I tapped the screen, surprised that he hadn't even bothered to lock it. I scrolled through his messages, finding the usual stream of work texts, friends, family. But then, just as I was about to give up and close it, I saw a message thread with a name I didn't recognize. Jenna. A sense of dread settled over me as I opened the thread. The messages were casual at first, work-related maybe, or friendly banter. But as I scrolled further, my stomach twisted. The messages became more personal, more intimate. Words like, miss you and can't wait to see you jumped off the screen, each one a dagger to my heart. And I could barely breathe as I put the phone back on the nightstand, the weight of betrayal pressing down on me like a physical force. I felt numb, like I was moving through a fog, the reality of what I'd seen refusing to fully sink in. My mind raced, grasping for some explanation, some reason that might make this all make sense. But deep down, I knew there was no excuse, no justification that could erase the pain I was feeling. I sank onto the bed, my head in my hands, feeling a sob rise in my throat. How could he do this? How could he look me in the eyes every day, kiss me goodnight, tell me he loved me while carrying on with someone else? I thought of Ethan, of the life we had built together, the promises we had made. It all felt like a cruel joke, like the ground had been ripped out from under me. As the night stretched on, I stayed there, curled up on the bed, my mind swirling with emotions I didn't know how to handle. I felt anger, betrayal, heartbreak, and a deep, aching sadness. But above all, I felt lost. The man I had trusted, the man I had built my life with, had shattered that trust, leaving me with nothing but questions and a hollow feeling in my chest. I barely remember how I made it through the rest of that night. Hours slipped by in a haze of disbelief and heartbreak, the weight of what I'd discovered pressing down on me with an intensity I hadn't known was possible. My mind spun in circles, replaying each message, each word that felt like a betrayal. I wanted answers, yet the thought of confronting Matt terrified me. How could I protect Ethan from the fallout? How could I possibly navigate this without shattering his world? By the time the first light of dawn slipped through the blinds, I was exhausted, though sleep had eluded me all night. I sat up, trying to shake off the weight pressing down on me, but I could barely summon the energy to get out of bed. My head pounded, my body ached, and every part of me felt hollow, as if something essential had been stripped away. Then, like a whisper of hope, I heard the soft creak of Ethan's door as he woke up. Just knowing he was there brought a sliver of comfort, like a warm light in the darkness surrounding me. I took a deep breath, reminding myself that no matter what, he needed me to be strong. I forced myself to my feet, smoothing my hair, willing the tears to stay at bay as I walked toward his room. Ethan was still rubbing sleep from his eyes when I pushed his door open, and his face lit up with a sleepy smile when he saw me. "Good morning, Mom," he murmured, stretching out his arms for a hug. His warmth, his innocence, his utter trust. It wrapped around me like a balm, soothing the raw ache in my chest, if only for a moment. "Good morning, sweetie," I whispered, pulling him close, breathing in his familiar scent, grounding myself in the simple comfort of his presence. He hugged me tightly, and I could feel his small hands patting my back, as if he knew I needed more than just a quick morning embrace. I lingered there, holding him close, letting his love fill the empty spaces inside me. I wanted to stay there forever, to protect him from the truth that had shattered my heart. But even as I tried to shield him, I could sense that he felt something was wrong. He was quiet as he got dressed, glancing at me now and then with a look that made me wonder just how much he understood. The days that followed were a blur. I went through the motions, making breakfast, packing lunches, going to work. But inside, I was a mess. The doubts that had once been whispers were now a constant scream in the back of my mind. Every time I saw Matt, I felt my stomach twist, the betrayal replaying in my head like a broken record. I wanted to confront him, to demand an explanation, but the thought of what that would mean for our family kept me silent. So instead, I did the only thing I could. I went to Ethan's room more and more often, seeking solace in his presence. Every evening after dinner, after I'd tucked him in and kissed his forehead, I found myself wandering back to his room, unable to leave. Sometimes I'd find an excuse to check on him, adjusting his blanket, smoothing his hair, pressing a gentle kiss to his cheek. Other times, I'd simply sit on the edge of his bed, watching his peaceful face, listening to the soft rhythm of his breathing, letting it steady my own fractured heart. One night, as I sat by his bed, Ethan stirred and blinked up at me, his eyes drowsy but alert. "Mom," he whispered, his voice soft and full of concern. "Why are you here?" I froze, not knowing how to answer. How could I explain to him that his room had become my sanctuary, that his presence was the only thing keeping me from falling apart completely? "I just wanted to make sure you were okay," I murmured, trying to keep my voice steady. He studied me for a moment, his small hand reaching out to take mine. His touch was gentle but firm, grounding me as though he could sense the storm raging inside me. "Mom, I'm okay," he said, his voice so calm and certain that I almost believed him. "But are you okay?" The question hung in the air between us, simple yet powerful. I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes, but I forced myself to smile, squeezing his hand. "Yes, honey, I'm okay. Just tired." He nodded, his gaze soft but unwavering. "You can stay if you want," he whispered, pulling his blanket up to make room for me. It was such a simple gesture, but it felt like a lifeline. Without a word, I slipped into bed beside him, feeling his warmth beside me, his hand still clutching mine. For a moment, I allowed myself to relax, to let go of the pain and confusion swirling inside me. Lying beside him, feeling his steady breathing, I could almost forget the weight pressing down on my chest. Ethan was my world, my reason for holding on, and in that moment, I knew I would do anything to protect him, even if it meant bearing this pain alone. Days turned into weeks, and I continued to drift through life like a ghost, putting on a brave face for Ethan, pretending everything was fine. But inside, the storm was growing, building with each day that passed. I couldn't shake the memory of those messages, the betrayal that had cracked the foundation of my life. Every time Matt touched me, every time he looked at me with that familiar smile, I felt a flash of anger, a deep sense of hurt that I struggled to contain. And yet I kept going to Ethan's room each night, seeking comfort in his presence, letting his innocence soothe the raw edges of my pain. He never questioned it, never pushed me away. He'd simply make space for me, pulling me close, his small hand resting in mine, as though he understood that I needed him as much as he needed me. One evening, as I sat beside him, he looked up at me, his eyes filled with a quiet wisdom that startled me. "Mom," he whispered, his voice barely audible, "are you sad because of Dad?" The question struck me like a lightning bolt. I opened my mouth to deny it, to assure him that everything was fine, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I felt a single tear slip down my cheek, betraying the pain I'd been trying so hard to hide. Ethan's hand reached up, gently brushing the tear away. "It's okay, Mom," he murmured, his voice so full of love and understanding that it brought a fresh wave of tears to my eyes. "You don't have to be strong all the time." His words undid me. I pulled him into my arms, holding him tightly, feeling his small body warm and solid against mine. I didn't speak, didn't try to explain. I just held him, letting my tears fall, allowing myself to be vulnerable for the first time since the night I discovered Matt's betrayal. In that moment, I realized that Ethan had been my strength all along, his love a beacon guiding me through the darkness. We stayed like that for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms, his quiet presence soothing the turmoil inside me. He didn't ask for details, didn't push for answers. He simply held me, his small hands patting my back, as though reassuring me that no matter what, we would face this together. That night, as I lay beside him, listening to his breathing slow as he drifted off to sleep, I made a silent promise to myself. No matter how painful this journey became, I would be there for him, just as he had been there for me. I would find the strength to confront Matt, to face the truth, for both our sakes. And no matter what happened, I would protect Ethan from the pain of this betrayal, shielding him from the darkness that had crept into our lives. I perched nervously on the edge of Ethan's navy blue comforter, still dressed in her silk nightgown as moonlight filtered through his window. My heart raced, knowing she probably shouldn't be here, but loneliness had driven her to seek comfort. "Can't sleep again?" Ethan asked me softly as he woke up, propped up against his headboard. "Dad's been gone 3 weeks this time." I sighed, sliding under the covers beside him. The familiar scent of his soap made me feel safe. "The house is too quiet. How was your day?" We chatted about Ethan's college classes, my work. We shared laughs that grew more intimate in the darkness. Hours passed as we lay facing each other, voices dropping to whispers. Hannah felt his body heat radiating. "You're so good to me," I murmured sleepily, shifting closer. That's when I felt a shift. Our eyes locked. I'm sorry," Ethan stammered to me, starting to pull away. But I caught his wrist to reassure him. "Don't be," I breathed, trailing my fingers up his arm. Electricity crackled between them. "I like knowing I still have this effect on a young man." We both knew this should not go any further and proceeded to sleep in the comfort of each other's arms. Each night brought new emotions. Some nights I felt raw, replaying Matt's betrayal in my mind, the words in those messages stabbing at my heart with each memory. I wondered if Matt would ever admit to it, if he'd come clean or if he'd keep pretending, going through the motions of a husband while living a double life. Other nights, I felt numb, almost detached from the pain, as though it was someone else's life I was witnessing unravel. I'd lie beside Ethan in the dark, my hand resting lightly on his back, and let the quiet lull me into a fragile peace. Ethan never questioned me. If he woke up to find me beside him, he'd simply cuddle close, wrapping his small arms around me, resting his head on my shoulder. He was my constant source of love, his silent comfort unwavering. I often wondered how much he understood, if he sensed the sadness that lingered around me like a shadow. Sometimes he'd give me a look, a quiet, knowing glance, as if he could see the hurt I was trying so hard to hide. One night, as I lay beside him, he stirred and opened his eyes, blinking up at me. "Mom?" he murmured sleepily. "Are you sad?" I swallowed, feeling a lump form in my throat. "Just a little, sweetheart," I whispered, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "But I'm okay." He didn't respond right away, just studied my face with those wide, innocent eyes. Then, he scooted closer, wrapping his small arms around my neck, and whispered, "You can be sad with me, Mom." Those words struck a deep chord in me, bringing fresh tears to my eyes. I wanted to protect him from all of this, from the darkness I felt looming over our lives. But his simple words, his willingness to share my sadness, broke down the walls I'd tried so hard to build around my heart. I pulled him close, hugging him tightly, feeling his warmth, his trust, his love. In his arms, the pain seemed to soften, just a little, like a wound finally beginning to heal. The days dragged on, each one filled with a quiet ache I couldn't shake. I became a master at pretending, pasting on a smile for Ethan's sake, going through the motions of our daily life. But beneath the surface, I felt like I was unraveling, each day pulling me further from the woman I once was. Matt's behavior only fueled the fire of my suspicions. He seemed oblivious to my pain, slipping in and out of the house, his phone always clutched tightly in his hand. When he'd smile at me or brush a kiss against my cheek, I'd flinch, the memory of those messages searing my mind like a scar I couldn't erase. The man I'd once loved felt like a stranger, a familiar face masking a secret life I could no longer ignore. In the quiet moments when Ethan was at school or asleep in his room, I'd sit alone, grappling with the anger and heartbreak twisting inside me. Part of me wanted to scream, to confront Matt and demand the truth. But another part, the part driven by fear, held me back. What would happen if I did confront him? What would it mean for Ethan, for our family? I felt trapped, torn between the desire for answers and the need to protect my son from the storm brewing in our home. As the nights wore on, Ethan's room became my sanctuary. I'd sit by his bed, watching him sleep, feeling the rise and fall of his breathing anchor me, grounding me in a reality that felt far from steady. Some nights he'd wake up, finding me beside him, and without a word he'd reach out for me, his sleepy smile a quiet reassurance that he was there, that I wasn't alone. His presence became my lifeline, a tether keeping me from falling completely into despair. One night as I sat beside him, lost in my thoughts, Ethan stirred and looked up at me, his eyes full of a quiet understanding that startled me. "Mom, are you okay?" he whispered, his small hand reaching out to touch my face. I blinked, struggling to keep my composure. "I'm fine, honey," I replied, but my voice trembled, betraying the emotions I'd tried so hard to hide. He held my gaze, his expression serious. "Is it because of Dad?" The question hit me like a punch to the chest, and for a moment I was speechless. I wanted to deny it, to assure him that everything was fine, but I knew he wouldn't believe me. I took a shaky breath, feeling tears prick at the corners of my eyes. "Sometimes grown-ups have things they go through," I managed to say, my voice barely a whisper. "But you don't have to worry about that, okay?" He nodded, but I could see the worry in his eyes, the way he looked at me as though he could feel the weight of my pain. He reached out, wrapping his small arms around me, holding me with a strength that seemed far too great for someone his age. "I love you, Mom," he murmured, his voice filled with a quiet determination that both broke my heart and gave me strength. "I love you too," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. I held him tightly, feeling the warmth of his embrace seep into the cold spaces in my heart, soothing the ache that had taken root there. As the weeks passed, my nightly visits to Ethan's room became a ritual, a place where I could let down my guard, if only for a little while. Each night, I'd sit beside him, his steady breathing a reminder that I still had something worth fighting for. And with each passing day, a new resolve began to take shape inside me. I couldn't live in the shadows anymore, couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine while the truth gnawed away at me. For Ethan's sake, for my own sanity, I needed to face what was happening. I needed to confront Matt, to demand the truth, even if it meant tearing apart the life we'd built together. One evening, as I sat beside Ethan, feeling the familiar comfort of his presence, I made a silent promise to myself. No matter how painful it was, no matter what I discovered, I would face it head on. I would find the strength to confront Matt, to demand the truth, and to protect my son from the fallout. I'd been holding on to the hope that things could go back to the way they were, that I could somehow shield Ethan from the pain I felt. But I knew now that I couldn't live in denial any longer. That night, as Ethan drifted off to sleep, I sat by his side, watching him, feeling a fierce love and protectiveness swell in my chest. He was my world, my reason for holding on, and I couldn't let him grow up in a home built on lies and betrayal. I would confront Matt for both our sakes, and no matter what happened, I would find a way to keep Ethan safe, to give him the love and stability he deserved. With a final, shaky breath, I kissed Ethan's forehead, whispering a promise to him and to myself. "I'll make this right, sweetheart. I'll be strong for you." He woke up. "Oh God, his eyes," I whispered as Ethan's face hovered closer and then inches from mine. My fingers trembled as I traced his strong jawline, feeling the light stubble. My heart was racing, knowing this was wrong, but feeling so incredibly right. We kissed. The rest of the night was magical. Tension released finally. It had been so long. As I left his room that night, I felt a new sense of resolve, a quiet strength that had been missing for so long. The path ahead was uncertain, and I knew there would be pain, but I was ready to face it. For Ethan, for myself, I would face whatever came, one step at a time. Hannah's resolve hardened over the following days. She rehearsed the confrontation in her mind, preparing herself for whatever Matt's reaction might be, aware that she could no longer carry the weight of this alone. Her fears were still there, coiled and ready to strike, but her desire for honesty, for herself and for Ethan, was stronger. She was done living in the shadows, done pretending for the sake of a facade that had already crumbled. One evening, when Ethan was at a friend's house, she seized the moment. She waited for Matt in the quiet of their living room, her heart pounding as he walked through the door. He seemed surprised to see her waiting, her expression calm but serious. She invited him to sit, keeping her voice steady, holding back the pain that simmered beneath the surface. "Matt," she began, her words slow but clear, "I know about Jenna." His face paled, the shock evident, and for a long, tense moment, they both sat in silence. Hannah felt an unexpected calm wash over her as she watched him struggle to respond, the weight of his guilt finally settling over him. Eventually, he confessed, stumbling through apologies and explanations, speaking of feeling lost, of the distance that had grown between them. But Hannah wasn't there for excuses. She was there for the truth, for clarity. And as he talked, she realized that the man she'd once loved had drifted so far from her that she didn't know if they could ever rebuild what they had once shared. Through quiet tears, she told him of the nights she'd spent feeling like a stranger in her own marriage, of how Ethan had become her anchor, the one person who'd kept her going. She told Matt she needed space, a chance to breathe, to figure out what life would look like without the betrayal overshadowing her every day. Matt listened, his remorse clear, though his apologies couldn't erase the hurt. The weeks that followed were challenging. Matt moved out temporarily, giving Hannah and Ethan the time they needed to find their footing. Hannah, however, found an unexpected strength during this period, anchored by the closeness she shared with her son. Ethan sensed the shift, the tension easing just slightly, and though he never asked questions, he remained by her side, his quiet support a constant comfort. Their bond deepened in those days. Ethan became Hannah's closest confidant, even if he didn't know all the details. He'd sit with her at the kitchen table, talking about his day, asking her to read him extra stories at night, and offering her his simple, unwavering love. In her son's eyes, she saw a reminder of the life she still had, of the love and happiness that hadn't been tainted by betrayal. She clung to that, finding a renewed sense of purpose. Months later, Hannah and Matt met again to discuss their future. After careful consideration, they decided to part ways amicably, their priority now on co-parenting Ethan and giving him the stability he needed. Though the marriage had ended, they both agreed that Ethan deserved a life filled with love and support, free from resentment or bitterness. With the dust settled, Hannah and Ethan's closeness grew. They found comfort in their routine, their quiet moments together, and the bond that had only strengthened through the trials they'd faced. On weekends, they'd go to the park, Ethan teaching her about dinosaurs or practicing his soccer skills, Hannah cheering him on with pride. Hannah discovered a peace she hadn't known before, a strength rooted in her love for her son and the newfound clarity she'd gained. The pain of betrayal lingered, but had softened, replaced by a resilience she hadn't known she possessed. And as she and Ethan faced the future together, Hannah knew they'd both emerge stronger, their bond unbreakable, their love enduring through every shadow and storm.